Okay, folks, welcome everyone. It's about 2 o'clock now, so we'll get started on the presentation. So welcome everyone to the B&O Ellicott City Station Museum. My name is Connor, and I am the manager here at the station. And to celebrate an early St. Patrick's Day weekend, I'll be doing a presentation on the Irish railroad workers, the force that built the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. You may have guessed from my accent, I am actually Irish. I am from County Fermanagh in the north of Ireland. I've been over in the States here since 2018, and I've been working at the museum here for about 4 years. So I've done a lot of research and background on my forebears who worked on the railroad, who had a much harder job than me. So to get started, this presentation is going to be focusing on a couple of different aspects of Irish history. It will discuss the role that Irish people played in the construction of the B&O Railroad. And the thing is that Irish people had a role to play in all levels of the formation of the B&O Railroad, from the men who financed it, the men who founded it, the men who oversaw construction, and the people who built the railroad. It will give an overview of the life and living conditions that Irish people would have experienced in the 1830s when they were building the railroad. And it will also discuss history of violence among Irish railroad workers back in the 1830s. So, get a little bit of context before we start talking about Irish railroad workers. Let's talk about what was Ireland like in the early 19th century. And Ireland in the early 1800s, Ireland was very much a society in turmoil. It was still in the aftermath of the Act of Union of 1800, which abolished the Irish Parliament and brought Ireland under the direct control of the British Parliament. Now, this happened in a reaction to several Republican uprisings in the late 18th century. In 1798, led by Wolfe Tone, and in 1803, led by Robert Emmet. These uprisings were directly inspired by the revolutions in America and France. They were also Republican ideals and ideology. And because of that, Ireland would lose its independence within the British Empire. Because of that, Ireland's economy would start to decline because it was basically used as an agrarian state by the British to kind of feed Britain. It was mostly used for farming. Next exception to that was in Ulster, which soon became a hub of manufacturing and industry. The linen trade grew a lot of wealth in the Belfast area, where you had linen mills producing linen for export, which proved to be very profitable. It's also important to remember that this was quite a sectarian time in Irish history. Until 1829, Irish Catholics did not have the right to vote until Daniel O'Connell, the great emancipator, won Irish political rights in the 1820s. So that kind of gives you a context of what Ireland was like. Because of this turmoil, a lot of people were ready to leave Ireland, and there was a lot of emigration from Ireland to North America. Now, Irish people have been going to North America since Europeans started colonizing this continent. But there's been several waves of Irish immigrants coming to North America. One of the first major waves was in the late 18th century when a lot of Irish people from Ulster, they were Ulster Scots, the Scotch Irish, usually Protestant backgrounds, they moved to America, usually settling in Canada. And this was really because of political and sectarian upheaval at home. To travel in the early 19th century meant that you had means to do so. It was quite difficult. It was quite expensive to sail across the Atlantic. So usually it was people who were relatively wealthy had the means to travel to Canada and the United States. But it was usually people who were from a more prosperous, likely Protestant or Presbyterian background. But still, a lot of people in the early 1800s did travel to the United States and Canada. About 1 million Irish immigrants would travel from about 1810 to about 1840. And majority of people who were traveling to North America would first go to Canada. This because it was still in British North America. So they would go usually from Ireland, likely to a port in Britain, such as Liverpool, and then they would go across the Atlantic to a port in Canada, and then go down to an American port. Generally, a lot of people would settle in Canada before moving on to the United States. So this was kind of a different waves of immigration at this time. Now, with that context of Irish people coming to America, let's talk about Baltimore. Baltimore, it is a city on the Chesapeake Bay. It's a charm city. But in the early 1800s, Baltimore was one of the fastest growing cities in the United States of America. Baltimore was a relatively young city. It only really started getting going around the 1750s. But when it started growing, it grew very quickly. By 1830, it was the third largest city in the Union, and had about a population of about 80,000 people. What really had Baltimore's advantage is its location. It's on the Chesapeake Bay, which means it's a more inland port than other eastern seaboard ports. And this matters when you want to get goods and people from the eastern seaboard to the Midwest, to the new territories that are in the United States. Because you have to remember, the United States is a new country, and it's a very big country, and it's getting bigger. People are moving out west. It's a challenge to get stuff out west. Baltimore had that advantage. Baltimore also was a major port of arrival for immigrants. A lot of people would arrive in Baltimore. A lot of Irish people traveling to Scotland and from Germany and Central Europe. But one of Baltimore's major advantage was the National Road, which actually runs right through Ellicott City. Baltimore and Frederick Turnpike went from Baltimore through Ellicott City towards Frederick. It would then go on to Cumberland and then go out west. And this was the main route west in the United States. This is one of the first major road building projects. And this really helped Baltimore grow and become very wealthy. So, grab some water. Sorry, put that there. Nope. So, So Baltimore is doing very well for itself around the 1820s. You have to remember that Baltimore is very strategic. In 1814, you had the Battle of Baltimore, and because the British wanted to take Baltimore so badly, kind of represented its importance to the United States. But by the late 1820s, Baltimore was facing new challenges, mainly from canals. So in 1825, the Erie Canal opens in the state of New York, which gives New York City a direct connection to the Great Lakes and, by extension, the Midwest. In Washington, D.C., the new federal city to the south of Baltimore, they were planning the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, which would have gone from Washington, D.C. along the Potomac River towards the Ohio. Now, Baltimore had a problem because you know anything about the geography of this area? We're in like the low-lying Piedmont area, the foothills of the Appalachians. It'd be very difficult to build a canal here because the land is so uneven. It would just not be practical to build a westbound canal from Baltimore. But because canals were being built, they were also a major employer of Irish immigrants. A lot of Irish immigrants would come from Ireland towards the United States to work on canals like the Erie Canal. And this was actually a practice that was very well established in Britain at the time. A lot of the major shipping canals in England were built by Irish immigrants, and this model was basically applied to the United States as well. So it was established that Irish immigrants would travel from Ireland to work on big engineering projects like roads, like the National Road, or on canals. So Baltimore had a problem. We can't have a canal. So the civic leaders of Baltimore decided to get together in 1827, and they decided that they were going to explore a brand new technology, the technology of railroads. Now, railroads at that time were kind of relatively new. In Britain, in the north of England, George Stephenson had just demonstrated steam locomotives on the Stockton and Darlington Railway in 1825, which we're celebrating the 200th anniversary of this year. And they saw the potential of a railroad and how it could be a solution for Baltimore's transportation crisis. So they envisioned that to build a railroad from Baltimore to the Ohio River. Now, the challenge is, no one had built a railroad before. No one knew how to build a railroad, and no one knew if it was even possible to build a railroad from Baltimore to the Ohio. It's a distance of over 300 miles, and you have the Appalachian Mountains between those points. So this was a huge engineering project. But this was seen as a very exciting project, and this was very much an elite-driven project because the guys talking about founding the B&O Railroad were really the elite and merchant elite of Baltimore. Some of the wealthiest men in America were discussing this. Some of these men were Irishmen. This is George and Alexander Brown. And Alexander Brown was an Irish immigrant. He actually was from County Antrim. He moved from Ballymena in 1800. He in America was a very established, or he in Ireland was a very established linen merchant. When he moved to the United States in the early 1800s, he would establish a banking and merchant and shipping firm, Alexander Brown and Sons, which is still a company that exists today, and it became very prosperous because Baltimore was such an important shipping port, and a lot of the goods and wealth coming from the cotton economy of the South that was being sent out across the Atlantic to Europe and down to the Caribbean. This proved to be very wealthy. So because the Browns were some of the wealthiest men in Baltimore at the time, and they actually met in February of 1827 at George Brown's home in Baltimore to discuss the founding of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Alexander Brown was on the founding board of the B&O Railroad. George Brown, his son, he was the first treasurer of the B&O Railroad. And because there was very wealthy established merchants, they knew the potential for this railroad, and they saw it could be a huge business opportunity for them. These were very much the kind of guys who did well as immigrants. They were very wealthy. They were from an Ulster Protestant background, which would be different from later immigrants. Oh God, what's going on? Okay, sorry about that. Sorry, brief interregnum there. Wonders of technology. It's never a struggle. There are some seats available up here at the front if anyone wants to sit down. All right, so where was I? Why are you not connected? Here we are. All right, cool. We're back in action. So whilst we were waiting for George Brown, he passed away on us. This is George Brown's gravestone in Green Mount Cemetery in Baltimore. And you can see on his grave, it says, "Here, sacred to the memory of George Brown, native of Ireland." So you can see his grave, very grand, very prosperous, but also he is kind of representing his Irish heritage, with even says so on his gravestone. If you were interested in walking around Green Mount Cemetery, most of the founders of the B&O Railroad are buried in there. You can find a lot of them. And some of the other Irish founders of the B&O Railroad were very prominent men. One of them was Charles Carroll of Carrollton. He was, by 1830, the last surviving signatory of the Declaration of Independence. And the Carroll family were quite prominent because they were part of the Catholic aristocracy of Maryland. Charles Carroll's ancestors originally came from Ireland in around the 1600s from the Midlands, the O'Carroll family, and they were established in Maryland. By the time of the Revolution, they were very prosperous landowners. Another very prominent man was William Patterson. If you may know, Patterson Park in Baltimore is named after him. He was actually born in Ireland, in County Donegal, and he became very wealthy during the Revolution, became one of America's wealthiest men. He's probably America's first millionaire by running guns from the Revolution to the rebel cause. Another prominent Irishman was Robert Oliver. He was born in Belfast, and his namesake lives on. The Oliver Viaduct, which is the bridge that spans Main Street, that trains still pass over today, is named in honor of Robert Oliver. Another Irishman was Talbot Jones. He was also an Ulster Protestant born in Ireland in 1771. So all of these men, excepting Charles Carroll, were all immigrants. They were all from Ulster. They were all from Ulster Protestant or Ulster Scotch background, the exception being Charles Carroll, who was part of the Catholic aristocracy. And Charles Carroll really was kind of the link between the revolutionary generation and kind of the railroad generation, because he was the last man to be alive when the railroad was, the last man to sign the Declaration alive when the railroad was founded. So you had all these wealthy men who had established the B&O Railroad, and their goal was to build a railroad. They weren't going to build a railroad themselves, but they were actually going to have contractors do that. So basically how the contractor system worked, and this was a model that was established with turnpike building and canal building, is that the railroad company would split up the railroad construction into separate divisions. Contractors would bid would bid for the contract to build these divisions. These contractors will be expected to hire their own men, pay their own men, and to establish and have their own materials after they won the contract from the railroad. This was an established model. This was the norm with major public work schemes, and it was applied to the railroad. A lot of these contractors were Irish or of Irish descent. A lot of them would have been men who had come over in previous decades and had established themselves with road building, such as with the National Road, or with canal building as well. One of these men, so to give you an idea of how it worked. So you can see here, this is my laser's working. You can see here we're Baltimore, the first stone that was laid by Charles Carroll of Carrollton on the 4th of July, 1828. That was laid here. The railroad would go about southeast to Relay, which is where now the Thomas Viaduct is. Then it would reach the Patapsco, and it would run parallel to the Patapsco to Ellicott's Mills. Now, the reason why Ellicott's Mills was the first terminus of the railroad was it was an established mill line on the Patapsco, and it was a kind of a connection to the National Road, the Frederick Turnpike, which was the main road going west from Baltimore. The reason why the railroad runs parallel to the river was the surveyors of the railroad didn't know what vehicles would be running on the railroad. Steam locomotives did not exist in the United States yet. They didn't know their capabilities or what they were possible to do. They assumed there would be horse-drawn cars running on the railroad. Horses can't really pull heavy loads uphill, so the railroad had to go in a flat and level grade as possible. Took advantage of what Mother Nature had already did, so they decided that it would run parallel to riverways running west from Baltimore, because nature has already done the work of cutting its way through the landscape. And that's why Ellicott's Mills was the perfect location for the terminus. One of these men who built the first division of the B&O, so from Avalon roughly to Ellicott's Mills, was a man named John McCartney. Now, John McCartney, we're kind of a focus on him because he has a very strong connection to this building. He was an Irishman. He was born in 1789 in County Down, mostly in the Belfast kind of area. At that time, Belfast was such a much smaller town than it is today. He was a Presbyterian. He was an Ulster Protestant. His family likely would have come over from Scotland during the Ulster plantation a couple of generations earlier. Don't turn off for me again, flipping heck. I don't know why it's doing that. Okay. I don't know why it's doing that. Maybe it's running out of battery. Who knows? I don't know. Yeah, maybe. We'll find out. Once it's straight. So, John McCartney, I've memorized this. John McCartney, he was an Ulsterman. He came over to America in 1818. When he emigrated to the United States, he first traveled to St. Andrews in New Brunswick in Canada, which was, British North America at that point. And then in 1818, he and his wife, Martha McCartney, traveled to Philadelphia. From Philadelphia, they would then move to Pittsburgh. And in 1826, John McCartney was a Mason. He actually worked on the Pittsburgh Western State Penitentiary. John then, after that, he would settle in Ohio in the Belmont County region, in an area called Hendrysburg, which was on the National Road. He worked on the National Road, likely as a contractor, road builder, and mason. So he had established kind of a professional bona fides. By 1829, the B&O Railroad is looking for contractors. Caspar Weaver, who was the first superintendent of construction of the B&O Railroad, he likely would have worked with John McCartney. I don't know what's going on here. I'm sorry about this. He likely would have worked with John McCartney on the National Road in Ohio. It's likely that's why John was then given the contract to build the first division of the B&O Railroad. Now, if I had the screen, I'd show you. In 1831, John McCartney was then, in 1829, John McCartney was then awarded the contract to build the Patterson Viaduct, which is the viaduct that spans the Patapsco River at Ilchester. If you ever go on the Gristmill Trail, if there's a bike bridge across that, that's actually on the last remaining arch of the Patterson Viaduct. Sadly, it was mostly destroyed in the flooding of the 1860s, but the one arch still remains. After the successful completion of the Patterson Viaduct, John McCartney in April of 1831 was then given contract to build a depot, a place of deposit at Ellicott's Mills. So from April of 1831 to November of 1831, John McCartney would have had the contract to build this building. So this building we're standing in was built by an Irishman. It was built by John McCartney. Likely his work crew would have been Irish immigrants as well. Largely, they would have hired migrants. Let's see if I can turn you back on. Sorry about this. What's going on? It's turning itself back on. Fun times. Where was I? So, John McCartney. John McCartney was given the contract to build the B&O Railroad. Let's see if it boots itself back up. I'm very sorry. An interesting thing about John McCartney in the census of 1830. Let's see if we can log back on this. Apologies for this technical glitches. This is going to be great editing for the video if it works. All right, so we're logging in. He was in the census of 1830. John McCartney is recorded as having a household of 200 men, or 250 men, 125 men under the age of 35, 125 men over the age of 35, which is pretty unique family. But because of that, bear with me, we'll get the video back on. Lovely technology. And this thing, I'm not running out of battery. It's just turning itself off for whatever reason. All right, we're back in action. Sorry, guys. Good idea. Good idea. All right, so John McCartney. All right, so here is from the B&O minutes of April of 1831. Resolved that the offer of John McCartney to construct the proposed buildings and walling for the accommodation of the depot of the company at Ellicott's Mills. So that's the evidence that we have that John McCartney would have built this building. This was in April of 1831. The next record we have of this building being complete was by November of 1831. It's important to note that the railroad reached Ellicott's Mills for public traffic in May of 1830. There wasn't a depot here for about the first year of the railroad's operation, mainly because there was a dispute between the Ellicotts, the landowners, and a man named Alan Thomas who had land on Mulligan's Hill, and he didn't want a railroad depot built on his property as he saw it. So that's why it took a year for this building to be built. But you can see 125 men in his household, John McCartney, a railroad man. So John McCartney, after he was awarded the contract to build the building here, probably would have been completed by the fall of 1831. He would then travel up to Philadelphia, where he would work with his brother James McCartney, who was also a railroad contractor on the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad, which was also an early railroad project. If you know, has anyone heard of Duffy's Cut? Duffy's Cut is on the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad. It is notorious. In 1832, there was likely a massacre of Irish railroad workers where they found a mass grave of at least 50 people. It's a very in-depth history. I can't go into it in detail because I'll be here all day. If you're interested, there is a book in this for sale in our gift store. But John McCartney would have worked on culverts on the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad near to Duffy's Cut, where it's likely that there was a mass grave of Irish workers. But after that, John would then come back to Maryland, and he would have worked on the Thomas Viaduct. And the Thomas Viaduct, if you know it today, is one of the kind of engineering landmarks of Maryland. When it was designed by a man named Benjamin Latrobe Jr., the son of Benjamin Latrobe, the Capitol architect. When it was designed, they said it was too big to stand up under its own weight. They called it Latrobe's Folly. John McCartney was given the contract to build this from 1833 to 1835. In Latrobe's diaries, there's a lot of accounts of him feuding with John McCartney. Apparently, John McCartney was a bit of a drinker, and that kind of got in Benjamin Latrobe's diaries. As he said, a little tipsy, pushing on his men at a great rate. And the Thomas Viaduct was completed by July 4th, 1835. It is still standing today. If you ever take the MARC train from Camden Station to Union Station, you travel over the Thomas Viaduct. CSX freight trains, way heavier than what was around in the 1830s, also travel over it. So it's still a standing landmark. And underneath here, you can see the Patterson Viaduct. This is Ilchester, about 3 miles up the road from here. So we have talked about the wealthy men who founded the railroad, the contractors who were won the contract to build the railroad. But let's actually talk about the laborers who built the line. It is estimated that about 60 to 70% of laborers who built the rail line were Irish or of Irish descent. And as I explained earlier, this was an established practice with canals and road building. You have to remember that very few native-born Americans would have wanted this work. It was dangerous. It wasn't very well paid. It was exhausting. And it wasn't really seen as a good source of labor. Baltimore was a major port of arrival for immigrants. So a lot of Baltimore, a lot of immigrants would be coming into Baltimore, and they would begin work on the railroad. One story I found in the Baltimore Gazette from 1829 is very sad. A cruel deception. Basically, what happened was a young man, an Irishman from Boston, had traveled down from Boston to Baltimore to look for work on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. To do so, he had to sell his own tools. And when he arrived in Baltimore, he realized that he had been conned and there was no work for him. And Nathaniel Drake was a scam artist. The young man also informed us that 100 or 200 Irish immigrants have been imposed upon in such a manner and have been induced to sell at auction in Boston their pickaxes and other implements of labor in the purpose of raising funds necessary to travel to Baltimore. So this was seen, Irish immigrants, they were seen as, easy to exploit. And this is a great example of how, today, people from immigrants, are seen as easy targets by less scrupulous people. Now, when you began working on the railroad, it was not very nice. What the Irish railroad workers working on the rail line had pretty dismal working conditions. They basically had shanty towns, which were basically little huts that would be designed to be built up and torn down as they were building the railroad as it was being moved out west. You have to remember this was in the winter and the summer. Irish people would have no protection to the incredible American summers and the horrible American winters. Be very brutal. We have one account. This is actually written by a Scottish travel writer, James Boardman, who was traveling around America in the 1830s and kind of showing off to the folks back home what was happening in the strange new land of the United States. And he actually arrived in Baltimore and he saw the construction of the B&O Railroad. And he wrote on this, the laborers employed in this and all great works of the kind in America are natives of Ireland. And I was happy to observe, and looking in their temporary wooden cabins, which are erected at different stations along the road, that there appeared to be a good deal of wild disorder in domestic arrangements, and the total absence of what an English cottager would term as comfortable. So there was no lack of the means to live. Every hovel had its swarm of children, its barrel of flour, a flitch of bacon, and the stone bottle of the creature, so whiskey. And the interstices were filled up with pigs and poultry. They called it Dublin, with antithesis to the splendor of the city it was named, because the old flour barrels were used as chimneys. Now, this was not a very good place to live. You would be very sick to exposure and disease. Disease outbreaks were very common. In 1834, there was a major cholera outbreak among laborers on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, as well as the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal near Point of Rocks in Frederick County, which would have been a major kind of killer for people working in this. There was no health and safety. It was not a very nice place to work. Now, the building of the railroad, this was very difficult. As I explained, the route of the railroad followed the Patapsco River. Back then, this was wild, untamed country. This was very difficult terrain. They were building through this land. Not many people had settled in this part of Maryland at this point. And to build the railroad, as I said, the B&O was the first railroad built in the United States. They were kind of inventing the technology as they went along. And the first type of rail used on the railroad was a thing known as strap rail. If you want a better vision of it, behind there is a kind of diorama of what strap rail looks like. You can look at that later. Basically, how it works is you would have a strap of iron, which would be nailed into wooden rails, and then these wooden rails will be affixed to granite foundation sleepers, which would be laid longitudinally parallel to each other and laid into the ground as a foundation. They basically used the material that they had available to them. The Patapsco River Valley has a lot of granite, like this building, so they used the granite. The problem was, these granite stones were incredibly heavy. This is a solid block of stone. This would have been incredibly difficult to move and maneuver. This had all been done by hand, maybe some pulley systems or maybe some mules. But if you want to get an idea, if you go outside behind our caboose, you'll see some big stone blocks. Those are strap rail stones that were found near Union Dam, about a mile up the rail line from here. And I was in my various hikes around Union Tunnel, I find some remains of the strap rails from the 1830s. You can see here the holes drilled into the rock and the rust from the iron nails that would have been used here. So imagine having to handle these huge stone blocks into place by hand. Because of this and you have to remember, this is in the early days of railroad construction, a lot of accidents would have occurred. A lot of people would have been killed and injured whilst building the railroad. One example was in 1829 in February, reported in the Niles Weekly Register, a distressing incident on the 10th section of the B&O Railroad. 4 men were crushed to death Thursday morning last, falling under a bank on which they were excavating. Their names were Patrick Hackett, Edward McGurry, Thomas Hughes, and Daniel Rangan, all natives of Ireland. And they said the first named was so literally crushed, he appeared not to have a whole bone remaining. The skull was much fractured, and the third was supposed to be suffocated. The fourth only had a few slight marks of injury. And this was the kind of accidents that would have occurred. So they were building an embankment. it would have collapsed. It would have buried him, killing him instantly. Another example that we have of an Irishman being killed on the railroad was during the construction of the Thomas Viaduct at Relay, Maryland. A man was killed yesterday by a fall from the first arch. He fell to the ground from a height of 55 feet, where he struck his head upon a stone and rebounded. His skull was fractured, and he suffered other injuries. He was a laborer by the name of Barney Doherty. So, that's a pretty unpleasant way to go out. We have another accident. I found this recently. This is from the Baltimore Republican Banner in 1830. Accident of distressing nature occurred on the railroad this morning. A temporary railway raised upon trestles, so like kind of temporary rails, has been erected on the road near Ellicott's Mills to facilitate the transportation of stone used in the construction of the viaduct over the Frederick Road. So the Thomas Viaduct, the railroad bridge that's still standing today. By some inadvertency, the car used upon this railway was suffered to slip from it to the ground, crushing and dreadfully mangling a man who was at work beneath. There is little hope of his recovery. Doesn't say the nationality of this man. Other accounts say he was likely Irish, but that would have occurred very likely just up the tracks from here when they were removing the Tarpeian Rock, which is a major outcropping of stone along the cliffside by the Patapsco. Whilst they were removing that stone, they used it to build the bridge here. So that would have occurred probably maybe a couple hundred feet from where we're standing today, which is a very unfortunate way to go. Now, as I talk about accidents, we're going to move on to violence on the railroad. And as it's kind of a cliche, where there's Irish people, there's violence. But there were several incidents of violence along the B&O Railroad. This is kind of a regular thing in kind of construction projects of this time. Because you can see along here in this map, various incidents of violence along the construction of the B&O Railroad between Baltimore and Wheeling. Violence was so common that the superintendent of construction, Caspar Weaver, actually issued a ban on ardent spirits on the construction of the B&O Railroad, so whiskey. I don't think that would have worked because, taverns and, stills are very easy to get. A lot of this violence wasn't just violence for the sake of violence. A lot of it would have had specific causes. One of these occurred in June of 1831 at Sykesville, Maryland, about 10 miles up the tracks from here. So in June of 1831, they were building the railroad between Baltimore, or Ellicott's Mills and the forks of the Patapsco. One of the contractors overseeing the construction of this line, a man from Pennsylvania named Truxton Lyons, had absconded. He had disappeared with all the money. And this was a problem because he had not paid his workers. Because of that, they decided, we're not getting paid, we aren't working. And in fact, we are going to rip up and destroy the culverts and rails that we have been built on. Now, this was a major kind of riot. The actual sheriff of the area was deployed, and the Irishman pulled him off his horse. Because of this violence, troops from Fort McHenry, the Maryland State Militia, were dispatched from Baltimore to Sykesville, or Sykes Mill, as it was called then. And this is the first recorded incidence of military troops being moved by railroad in the United States. They would put down this riot. Several hundred men were arrested, and they would have been dismissed from their jobs. Now, this would have cost the railroad over $6,000 in damages and lost time. Now, because of this violence, the leadership of the B&O Railroad, Philip Thomas and Jonathan Knight, the chief engineer, would make sure that contractors had the funds to actually pay their workers, and they would establish a relief fund for the wives and children of the men who had lost work because of this. They kind of changed the working practices in reaction to this, but this was kind of violence that would have occurred not too far from here. Another example of violence is faction fighting. Now, faction fighting is a major theme in Irish history around this time, the early 1900s. And faction fighting basically was When Irish people traveled across America, traveled across the Atlantic to America, they did not leave their kind of beliefs and rivalries and sectarian kind of traditions behind them. They brought them with them. You have to remember that Ireland was a much smaller place back then. It was unlikely people would have ever left their own counties or provinces. And because of that, there would have been a real kind of cultural and regional rivalry between different parts of Ireland. And this would lead to faction fighting. Now, faction fighting is kind of reflective of Irish politics at the time. There would have been a lot of secret societies because of British oppression. They weren't really allowed to form political parties or political movements. So a lot of them would be violence-based secret societies like the White Boys or the Ribbon Men. A lot of early Republican movements would have been based along this. One of the major faction fighting occurred on road and canal building projects in Maryland, Pennsylvania, Indiana. It's very well documented. And two of the major factions were the Corkonians and the Fardowns. So the Corkonians were likely men from the province of Munster in County Cork, down here in the south. And the Fardowns were likely men from the Midlands of Ireland, around kind of, Midlands are in Westmeath, Longford, Leitrim, kind of eastern Connacht, western Leinster. As for context, if anyone wants, I'm from here in County Fermanagh, that's where I'm from. So if anyone wants to know where my accent is, that's me. So you can see these kind of two specific areas of Corkonians and Fardowns. And a lot of these guys, they were fighting against each other because they were fighting for the same jobs, the same contracts, the same kind of working life. And this was seen as a major rivalry. And this would lead to violence. This would occur in several incidents on the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal in the 1834. And then in June of 1834, during the construction of the Washington branch line, the B&O's line between Baltimore and Washington, which is now the Camden line, if you ever take the Camden trains from Camden Station, there was a major instance of factional fighting between the Corkonians and the Fardowns. During this conflict, shanties were burned, men were attacked with pikes, men were killed, men were grievously injured. And to put down this fighting, troops again were dispatched from Fort McHenry to put down this violence. And they would arrest over 300 men in this. You can see in the quote from the Niles Weekly Register, 60 or 70 men have been arrested and sent to prison. It is believed that 4 or 5 people have been murdered in these affrays, with broken heads, black eyes, and bloody noses without count. So they've collected about 40 muskets to use against the troops. So this was a major kind of instance of violence. And this violence was stopped when a local Jesuit priest John McElroy, he would step in and broker a peace treaty between the Corkonians and the Fardowns. So, this is the kind of violence that would have occurred, and not too far from here in Howard County. But one of the worst instances of violence that we know about during the construction of the B&O's Washington branch line occurred in November of 1834 when murder occurred on the B&O Railroad. Basically what happened was in November of 1834, a gang of laborers, Irishmen, would have raided and attacked the hut or shanty of a railroad contractor, John Watson. John Watson was also an Irishman. He was actually a Catholic from Ulster. And basically they attacked him. There was some dispute over payment or lack of payment, or potentially a working dispute. What happened was they went in and they started to attack John Watson. He was basically attacked. He was nearly clubbed to death on the first night. On the second night, when he was lying in recovery in his sickbed, they would attack him again, and they would also take out his assistant, a man named William Mercer, and John Gorman, who was also a railroad contractor in the area, and savagely beat them. As we can see here in the quote from the Niles Weekly Register, Mr. Watson was lying wounded, and after breaking open the door, they deliberately murdered him in a most barbarous and shocking manner, the back of his head being cut open and the brains scattered about. Mr. William Mercer, one of Watson's assistants, was present in the office when the attack on it was made and was dragged out and shot dead. So Mercer, I don't know his nationality, was potentially an Irishman as well. This was a major instance of violence, and the Maryland State Militia was deployed once again to arrest these rioting workers. Over 300 men were arrested. Several men were given sentences. Man Owen Murphy was convicted of murder, and he was sentenced to death by hanging. His sentence was later commuted, and he was just sent to hard labor. Other men, Patrick Gallagher and Terence Coyle, were also guilty and sentenced to 18 years hard labor. And this was a major sensation. This is a major news in the contemporary media of the time. Reporting of these murders was in newspapers as far as New York, Tennessee, Kentucky, would repeat the stories from Maryland journalists. Because a lot of newspapers would print different stories from around the country. This was seen as a major outrage at the time, and there was a major public outcry against this kind of violence and the danger of Irish people in their communities. But we have to remember that not all Irish people were dangerous, violent, drunken louts who were killing each other and clubbing each other's heads in. You have to remember this. At the time, there was significant anti-Irish discrimination, hibernophobia. A lot of it was sectarian-based because a lot of these workers would have been Catholics, and this was seen as a threat to a lot of white Americans, Protestants. This was a lot of the stereotypes of the fighting Irish kind of were built from this. But you have to remember that this instance of violence kind of reflects the time. You can almost say it's early labor organizing. The concept of unions didn't really exist then. These are workers who are getting together and kind of fighting for better working conditions, either with each other or with their contractors, using the means which they had, which was violence. And you have to remember, the early 1800s was a very violent society, especially in Ireland, where a lot of political organizing was through the establishment of secret societies, armed groups, especially in the fight against the British. A lot of this kind of was used to in America as well. So you can say it's early labor organizing. Now, a lot of what I've talked about is in the 1830s, the decade before An Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger, the Great Famine of Ireland. In 1845, the Irish potato crop fails, and this leads to one of the greatest disasters in Irish history, the Great Famine. During this time, between 1845 to about 1855, over 1 million people emigrate to the United States, Canada, and Britain. Over 1 million Irish people would die in Ireland, either of disease, starvation, or lack of nutrition. Because of this, a lot of refugees fleeing the Great Famine, traveling across the Atlantic in coffin ships. A lot of employers would have been employed by railroad, like the B&O, as it was being built from Cumberland towards the Ohio River, as well as other major railroad building projects. The 1850s is really kind of the railroad mania. It's railroad boom. Thousands of miles of railroads are being built at this time, and a lot of them were being built by Irish immigrants. In the 1860s, the start of the Transcontinental Railroad, a lot of that would have been built by immigrant labor from Ireland as well as China. And this really kind of tied the country together. But a lot of immigrants would have arrived in Baltimore. A lot of them would have worked in Baltimore for the B&O Railroad at the Montclair Rail Yards. It's estimated by 1880, 25% of the population of Baltimore was Irish or of Irish descent. So it was a major kind of demographic at the time. So I'm going to wind up now. Hopefully my computer doesn't die on me for the third time. Sorry about that. Does anyone have any questions, thoughts, comments, anything to discuss before I wrap up? Yes, sir. Some of the other nationalities that were built railroad, were they Scots or Welsh? Yeah, so a lot of immigrants would have been Germans. Germans would have been a major kind of port. Baltimore, a lot of German immigrants would have come there. There would have been a lot of linguistic rivalries here. There would have also been people from Britain, Central Europe as well. Not to the same extent, as far as I'm aware. Mainly because there wasn't a major like wave of emigration from those areas. A lot of Scottish people would be coming to the United States and Canada at the time. A lot of them would be working on engineering projects as well. A lot of free African American labor would have worked on the railroad as well. Enslaved labor wouldn't have been used for the building of the railroad, mainly because of it didn't make economic sense. Because to use enslaved labor, you would have to pay. Slaves were seen as an asset. You had to pay the slave owner to use the slaves, whereas immigrant labor, people coming from Ireland, from Germany, from Scotland, wherever, was seen as a lot cheaper. Also, Baltimore had a major free black population as well, so a lot of African American men would have worked on the building of the railroad as well. Any other questions? A question there.
When did it make it up to Frederick?
So let me go back to my map. So Frederick by 1831. It starts off in Baltimore and starts building around 1829, reach Ellicott's Mills by 1830, Frederick by 1831, Harper's Ferry by 1834. Then they reach Cumberland in 1842 and Wheeling at the Ohio in 1853. It took them 25 years to get to Wheeling. Question there. That is in the B&O Museum downtown, basically in the reception area when you enter the museum. If you ever take the first mile ride from Mount Clair, that at the end of that first mile was where they would have laid the first ceremonial first stone in 1828. It wasn't really a load-bearing stone. It was just like a thing they put in the ground to say they were laying a first stone. And at some point, it was dug up and brought back to the B&O Museum.
The other question I have was, I understand the Irish were called candy dancers?
Yes. Good question. That's one of these things where, different, you have different etymologies. A lot of Gandhi dancers, some of it I think is a kind of southern like slang, like it was used mostly in the South. A lot of it for African American laborers as well. The different kind of phrasing, like a lot of Irish workers are referred to as navvies. I'm just describing them as laborers or workers because that's how it's described in contemporary sources. There's different ways of referring to them. It's kind of confusing as to when. I don't know if they would have used it at that time. Question there, sir.
Did criminal transportation have a role in getting unskilled labor here?
Not really at this point, because before the revolution, in the colonial period, a lot of criminals would have been sent as indentured servants or criminal labor to North America. By this point, in Britain, transportation is likely going to Australia, like the Van Diemen's line to New Zealand, which, much worse face. Like originally it would have gone to North America. When they lost North America, they sent them to Australia. Around that time, around the 1830s, 40s, 50s, that's what he would have done. Question there? Yeah. Oh, you have a hand up? Yep.
So in the 1830s to 50s period, you mentioned the census period where they had the man with 125 people at a set. So what proportion of the individuals working on the railroad in that time were Irish?
It's hard to judge, really. It doesn't say in this. Let me go back to it. It doesn't say like their it doesn't say to their native identity where they were born. A lot of it's kind of speculation and using contemporary accounts. We do know John McCartney was Irish. I find his census data from later decades. He says place of birth Ireland. I find his emigration records. It is likely he would have used Irish labor. Potentially he would have mostly used Ulster Protestant labor because he himself was an Ulster Protestant. And there was sectarian hiring practices was quite a common thing. Because there was such a huge amount of labor needed, maybe those sectarian things, they just needed workers. They needed men to clear the land, lay the rails, and it was a lot of people. We don't know exactly if they were all Irishmen, but it's fairly likely, because, that was the time. Questioner?
Yeah, is there a place to find, like, the list of laborers, like, were there records that have the names of the people?
Not really. A lot of these people were lost to time. So a lot of, a lot of census records at the time, it's kind of people who had property or were head of a household. Um, some Irish workers would have, after they worked on the railroad, they were basically itinerant workers. They would move to different railroad building projects or canal building projects, basically earning money to send back home as remittances, or to get a bit of money to buy some land, settle a farm, establish themselves somewhere. We don't know what happened to a lot of people because records at this time aren't the best. So yeah, it's kind of it's easier to find records of people like Charles Carroll or Robert Oliver or William Patterson because they are wealthy men who have records, whereas the guys who are doing the actual physical labor, a lot of it is just kind of lost to time. We don't know their stories. A lot of it because it wasn't written down.
What was the railroad started making better records, like paychecks and things like that?
Not, I don't, a lot of contractor stuff, I don't know if it was kept. One of the great losses of railroad history was in the Great Fire of 1904, the B&O's headquarters burnt to the ground, probably with it most of its early records from the 1830s. So it's a great shame we don't have that. Maybe it was written down and we lost it. So, that's my cop-out excuse of I don't know. Question there. Yes, the Ilchester Tunnel. Yeah. So that tunnel, as we go back to the map where we had, where's our map? Yeah, where's our map? No, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry. We'll go back to our map. Here we are. So as you can see, the railroad runs parallel to the Patapsco. It is not a very quick, direct route. It's twisty, it's turny. By the end of the 19th century, locomotives can go faster, they can go further. One of the major works of the old main line, the old main stem, was straightening out some of the kinks of the 1830s engineering. A lot of that meant building tunnels and bypasses of the original 1830s route. That's why they built the tunnel at Ilchester in 1902 through Buzzards Rock. If you ever walk around that way, it goes along the original path. That tunnel by the early 1900s, they have better kind of like mining equipment. They have explosives, they have dynamite, a lot more advanced than would have been 70 years earlier in the 1830s. Yeah, so they straighten the route out as they go. This line here is basically the same alignment as it would have been likely in the 1830s. But they kind of straightened out the route as they could. This is Ilchester here. You can see this kink in the headland here, Buzzards Rock, and that's why they had to go around it. Then when they built the tunnel, they went straight through it. So, yes, questioner.
You mentioned that later railroads were built by Chinese immigrants. Was that because the projects like this attracted the latest immigrants who were poor?
Pretty much, and a lot of this is, the West Coast. So, a lot of immigrants were coming from China to ports like San Francisco to build that. And then it was kind of you had the Continental Railroad, but you had the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific, and they were kind of building together. A lot of the Central Pacific would have been Asian workers. A lot of the Union Pacific would have been, European Irish workers, because they were coming from different parts of the world. It's a whole lot of history. It's like a lot of Chinese people were horribly discriminated and exploited against. Here on the West Coast, I'm not going to say there weren't any Chinese people, but unlikely there would have been in the 1830s. All right, we'll take one more question so we don't all spend all day here. You had your hand up first.
Did St. Paul's, the church here, have any connection, or did it serve the Irish railroad community?
Yes. So St. Paul's, Ellicott's Mills really kind of grows in the 1830s. Mainly, a lot of what you see on Main Street here was built around the 1830s. St. Paul's was established 1837, 1838. When it was established, there would have been a lot of Catholics in the area. A lot of them likely would have been Irish people who had come from the area, may have settled here. A lot of them may have been from Doe Regan, Charles Carroll, Carrollton. Laborers would have likely been Catholics as well. There would have been both. You have to remember, Maryland had a big Catholic community because it was the Catholic colony, I guess. So that's when St. Paul's kind of was built around that time. I don't know exactly if they were guys who came here from the railroad, but a lot of the buildings in town, like the Patapsco Bank and a lot of Main Street buildings, were built around the 1830s, 40s period, kind of because of the growth of the the economic boost of the railroad coming into town, because everyone had to come to Ellicott's Mills. It was like a tourism destination to get out of Baltimore. All right, so what time are we at? I don't know. You've been listening to me for far too long. 3:01, so just about an hour. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you for taking your time on a Saturday afternoon. If you are interested, on April 16th, I will be doing another presentation on railroading before the B&O. So we are celebrating the 200th anniversary of the founding of the B&O Railroad, of the founding of the Stockton and Darlington Railway, generally regarded as the first railway in the world. I'm going to be talking about what railroads and railways were like before the B&O was founded in 1827. The B&O was technically the first American railroad, but there were actually a lot of railroads before it. So I'll be talking about that kind of prehistory. We're coming up to the 200th anniversary of the founding of the B&O. Watch the space. Hopefully we'll be doing stuff for that. TBC. So yeah, and also on May 7th, we will have a guest speaker, Michael O'Connor. He is a retired engineer. He will be doing a presentation on the history of the building of bridges on the B&O Railroad. So he'll be talking about the Thomas Viaduct, the Oliver Viaduct, other early construction from an engineer's perspective. So if you are interested in that, you can register the same way you registered for this. If you want to take one of the activity guides on the table in the other room, you'll find more info about our other events. Thank you for listening, guys. Please take the time to explore the rest of the museum. If you have any other questions, I will be hanging around. If you want to ask me anything else, I have my business cards here. I'll leave them on the table. Feel free to take one. Thank you very much, guys.
You built tunnels before